Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Mirowitz Center program today. We have a very good crowd that is going to be joining us today, and we welcome Sheldon Enger back today for the Mirowitz Center program, What Really Happened at Mount Sinai. Sheldon, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. So as we prepare for Passover, the celebration of Passover, it's a good time really to think about the events at Sinai. You might add, well, the Passover is all about celebrating freedom. But in every instance in the Torah where God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go, it's always not just let my people go, it's always that they may worship with me. And that basis of that of worshiping with God really comes at Sinai. And we don't deal with that issue during Passover. We deal with freedom, which is 50% of the equation. The other 50% of the equation of worshiping with me, what happened at Sinai, gets pushed off until another month in the holiday of Shavuot. But Shavuot just doesn't have the same kind of attention, the same kind of draw that Passover has. So I'm going to talk about Sinai as part of the Passover experience. Judy, can we get our slides up?
Can everyone see that? Good.
Good. Okay. So let's move to the next slide, Judy, if you would. So we learn in Passover that slavery is bad, that the Jews had been enslaved for an extended period of time, and they were suffering under the yoke, and they looked for freedom. But freedom without justice, without a sense of community, can be just as bad as slavery, can be chaos. So freedom in terms of and justice and building a sound community really is a critical part of the freedom process. And so that is why we're going to talk about today in terms of how do we create a just society, and what does the learning at Sinai teach us about that process? Next slide, please. The problem with both Passover and by adjunction and conjunction with that, with the Sinai experience, is the fact that many scholars, in searching of Egyptian documentation, don't see anything in it in terms of Israel being enslaved. And so they question the credibility, the reality of the Passover. And by conjunction, they would question the reality of the Sinai experience. Academia has studied Egyptology more than any other ancient society other than perhaps Greece. As a result, we know a great deal about Egypt, particularly at the time in terms of when the Passover would have occurred, or the exodus from slavery and the Sinai experience. And there's nothing in terms of the Egyptian documentation that gives any clue that Israel was ever in Egypt. So I think this map will give us a little bit of insight in terms of what was going on in the Middle East at the point in time about when slavery and the exodus would have occurred. No, going back to the slides. Back to the map, please, G. Okay. Egypt became unified in the year 1400 BCE, and this is pretty close to the time in terms of when, certainly would be during the time that slavery of the people that would become identified as Israel would have been in Egypt. Egypt had been a divided kingdom for centuries. The northern kingdom, which was headquartered had its capital in Memphis, was ruled by a group of kings called the Hyksos. And there was entirely civil war coming from the southern kingdom, which was in Thebes. And by the year 1400 BCE, the southern kingdom prevails and the Hyksos are driven out. Now we know from Egyptology that the Hyksos kings welcomed people who came from the Levant region, which is where Israel and Jordan are today, as to work, to live there part-time, to take food back with them. So it was a transit. We know from the Hyksos that it was a transitory society in terms of people who were migrated to Egypt. We also know that once the Hyksos were defeated and the southern kingdom takes over, that these people are made into laborers. Now there's documentation on that that's called papyruses, and each one is numbered. And these papyruses identify that there were a large number of people engaged either in labor, and some say as slaves, from all over the region, including the region in terms that would have included Israel and Jordan, which is known as the Levant. In fact, one particular document identifies a tribe that came in from Edom, which is just east of where Israel's at, and settles into Egypt as a group of laborers. Laborers is the more common term in terms of Egyptian documentation. What's also significant about the period of 1400 BCE is that Egypt decides to go to war with the Hittite Empire to get to which was the dominant empire in the north. To get to the Hittites and attack the Hittites and get their wealth, they had to go up the coastline. And this was led by a pharaoh named Merneptah. And Merneptah conquered the entire region of what is presently Israel. Everything east of the Dead Sea. West of the Dead Sea, all the way up through Syria, Lebanon, up to the southern Turkey, where they engaged the Hittites. Merneptah comes back and they build a monument that exists in Egypt that identifies all of the peoples that he conquered. Included in that name, the name is Israel and the Canaanites. And it says the Israelites have been laid waste, they've been destroyed. Now the problem with that, with the Merneptah, what is called the Merneptah stele is a monument, is that if Israel in the year 1400, or really around 1390s, 1380s, was still in the land, it seems to work against the fact that they could have been enslaved in Egypt. So both could not happen. So this is one of the main elements that scholars have included, that it just, the biblical story could not be possible. There's another set of documents that are also problematic. If you look in terms of Egypt, down the Nile River, halfway between Memphis and Thebes, is a place called Tel El Amarna. Now, Amarna was the capital of the Middle Kingdom, or the capital of Egypt, during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah. And in Amarna, a tell is really a mound of dirt that covers up a city. So the archaeologists dug through the mound of dirt. They discovered the city of Amarna and the palace that existed at that time. And there's a series of letters that came from the area of what today is Israel, the coastline, from Egyptian soldiers who were in forts up and down the coast, the Mediterranean coast, talking about uprisings by the Israelite tribes and trying to put them down, and the need for reinforcements, and discusses the campaigns on a continuous basis. There's a series of letters. Once again, the problem becomes, for those who want to look to the biblical accounts, is that how could it be that Israel is still in the 1300s, was in the land and not enslaved? So we have a number of problems in terms of logistics, and scholars frequently dismiss the claims in terms of the biblical claims of being enslaved and the strive for freedom and the Sinai experience as a result. But there are also other documents called papyruses. Papyrus is paper that's produced out of a plant. And most of the papyruses that have been discovered in Egypt seem to clearly indicate that there were slaves, and these slaves are laborers, as some of them are described, are called Apiru or Ibiru, pretty close to Hebrew, Ibiru or Apiru. And they worked in building storage cities. And it describes the methods by which they did their work, which are identical to the methods in terms of described in the biblical accounts. So there is support for the fact that these Apiru or Ibiru, who came from the Levant, were in Egypt. And scholars believe, and some scholars believe, that this is the group that ultimately was part of the Exodus. There's another papyrus dated a little bit later, during the reign of Ramesses III. And Ramesses III, it says, forced out a large group of Apiru who refused to work on the construction projects. And he forced them out of Egypt. Doesn't say that they led a revolt. Says that he forced them out because they refused to work on the projects that were assigned to him. They initiated a labor strike. And the same year that he forced them out, there's another series of documents that says that a group of people that are described as the Sea People, Philistines, attacked Gaza in the south of Israel, what is Israel today, but it's the Roman Empire. And the Egyptians went to war with this group of people, the Philistines and the Sea People. Now, the Sea People are people who came out of the Minoan territory. If you look up where Turkey's at, you'll see where Minoan Mycenaean territory, and the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were in civil war. The Mycenaeans prevailed, and the Minoans left, and they went to the Philistines, to where the area of the Philistines they became where the Philistines had settled, in the area of Ascalon on the map. So now I'm going to read a passage to you from the Torah. It says, now when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not let them lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was near. For God said, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God let the people round about by the wilderness of the Sea of Reeds. Talking about the same event. We know now from the Egyptian papyrus that the war, Egypt's war with the sea people, Philistines, took place in the year 1198 BCE. So we can document the Exodus at that point in time, which for many people and for many scholars is enough authority to indicate that that's who left Egypt, was a group of people called Apiru, or Hebrews. It did not represent all of Israel. The reason why Israel was still in the land during that period of time is because they never left. Only one tribe, according to some academics, others maybe two tribes, were part of the Hebrews, who ended up taking the journey through the Sinai and the experience that we're going to be talking about in terms of the receipt of the Ten Commandments. Okay, so that's our story. It's not all of Israel that made the Exodus. It's a small part of what would become Israel, which most scholars believe included were the Levites. Because the Bible tells us that all of the people who were in Egypt identifies them all as Levites. Moses is a Levite. Aaron is identified as a Levite. Hur is a Levite. Joshua is a Levite. Miriam is a Levite. Phinehas is a Levite. So everybody who is named in the biblical text is identified as a Levite. So an important line of scholarship is that it was only one tribe that was enslaved and that had the Exodus experience that we're going to be talking about, and therefore became the priests with respect to Israel as a whole. Okay, next slide, please. But no one's ever found Sinai. So some doubt the realism. Archaeologists have been looking at the wrong place. Sinai was a whole area in that period, and there were at least 9 mountaintops in that area. In ancient time, Sinai identified an area that stretched all over the southern Levant. And Moses was instructed by God, when you have freed the people from Egypt, you worship God at this mountain. And this was the mountain of God, where he was living when he was living with his father-in-law, a mountain called Mount Horeb, or Seir in the Bible, as it's identified. So Moses must have gone back to that mountain, which we now know is in northwest Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Most people know the Cecil B. DeMille version of what happened at Sinai. Booming thunder and bolts of lightning accompany Moses as he ascends the mountain. And as Moses descends the mountain, or as Charlton Heston descends that mountain, he didn't have his rifles with him. Charlton Heston was carrying these 2 heavy stone tablets inscribed with 10 commandments, his face radiating God's glory. We know that story, but the biblical version is much less familiar, and it's difficult to follow. Okay. So what happens is thunder and lightning occurs as Moses descends the cloud, carrying the 2 commandments, the 2 tablets. Next slide. Next, please. The Bible presents law giving not as a single event, with Moses receiving the 10 commandments and coming down at one point in time, but it doesn't end. It's a continuous process that starts at Sinai, but doesn't end until 40 years later. Moses descends the mountain not once, but 8 times in the biblical text, and each time in the 8 times, something else happens. The whole story covers 3.5 books of the Bible: Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and parts of I lost my train of thought. Okay. The text tells us God called Moses from the mountaintop, and the former slaves are invited to be his treasured people if they agree to obey his commands. Now, they don't know what the commands are yet. They accept the offer, though they've not heard the terms. Next. And Moses told he will be given a special audience with God, and the people are told that they should listen in because God wants them to be witnesses to Moses' receiving of the commandments and the laws, so that they know it wasn't arbitrary, that it wasn't Moses' laws, but it came from God. It's told in exalted language, denoting the tension of events that have never been witnessed before and never occurred before. The purpose of the story is to convey the awesomeness of this moment of time, a moment of time that changed history, not only for Israel, but all of humanity. The covenant contains words not for one people, but for all people, not for one generation, but all generations. 10 commandments. It was only the starting point, because after the 10 commandments would come a whole system of laws for creating a just society beyond the 10 commandments. Okay. Moses instructed on the third day, God was going to come down on the mountain to enable the people to experience Moses receiving instructions. But the text already told us Moses that God's on top of the mountain. He came down earlier. And the people are instructed to remain pure so that they can experience the theophany. So there's a lot of purity regulations that are involved in terms of boundaries are established to prevent people from getting too close. And the people are pushing and shoving, trying to get close to make sure that they can see the events that occur. And thunder and lightning and a dense cloud cover occurs, and the mountain trembles violently, according to the story. And God came down on the mountain. God was already there previously, though, when he was talking to Moses. And the text tells us that Moses went up to the top. God tells Moses to tell the people not to gaze on the Lord, lest they perish. But he should come back now with Aaron. So Moses descends. People are terrorized. They ask Moses to excuse them from this process of listening. And Moses excuses them. Moses goes back up the thick cloud covering the mountain, and one after another, the laws are conveyed to Moses with Aaron witnessing them. Then Moses descends the mountain, and he relays the laws to the people orally. There are no tablets. Okay, he comes down the mountain. He tells them orally what he experienced from God and what God told him the commandments would be. And that night, the text tells us, on his own initiative, Moses wrote down the 10 commandments on a scroll. There is no tablet yet. Cecil B. DeMille got it wrong. So the covenant, what is first 5 tablets? 5 deal with relationships with God. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods. Okay. So the first 2 commandments deal with God and the relationship with God. One of the common mistakes that people make is when they read the first 2 commandments, they say this is the basis of monotheism. It's not monotheism. It is called monolatry. It's not that this is not a statement there's only one God in the universe. It's a statement that you, Israel, shall only have one God. The concept of monotheism will come later in Israel, maybe 1,000 years later. Okay. So you shall not swear falsely. You will keep the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. 6 days shall you labor. This is the 4th commandment. This was unique. People worked all of the time. in the ancient world. There was no Sabbath. This is unique of taking a time out for being with your family, a time for spiritual replenishment. And then the last 5 all deal with relationships with humanity. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. And you shall not covet your neighbor's house, his wife, or his property. So this is the beginning, a morality code. More laws will follow. Next, please. Next, Judy. So what do the people experience? Deuteronomy tells us, the Lord spoke to you out of fire. This is Moses talking in the book of Deuteronomy. You heard the sounds of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. He declared to you his covenant, which he charged you to observe. When he finished speaking with Moses, he gave the 2 tablets of stone written by the finger of God. Why 2 tablets? Could have been very much, if we're told there are only 10 key words that represent each of the commandments, could have easily been on 1 stone, but it's 2 stones. We've never seen the 2 stones. Next, please. Then Moses goes back up in Sinai. The text tells us the next day, the people ratify the oral covenant that Moses received, and they go through rituals. Moses told to send the mountain once more time, and this time he's going to receive stone tablets, the text tells us, written by God as evidence of the theophany. When Moses arrives, he learns he's going to first receive and not receive the tablets, but he's going to receive lengthy instructions for the construction and dedication of a divine abode, the tabernacle. And he's going to receive instructions for consecration of priests and their vestments. And he's told that it is going to be in the tabernacle where God's going to meet with him so that he can impart his laws to Moses. And this will be done over a period of time. And he will be charged with transmitting them to the people. He still doesn't have those tablets. We're told that Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days. Meanwhile, the people build this golden calf when Moses is gone. Moses receives the tablets and is about to descend when God gave him the bad news that the Israelites have strayed. Moses beseeches God's forbearance. He descends, he breaks the tablets, he destroys the calf, and takes measures to end the crisis. Moses returns on top of the mountain, and in that process, he's remaining 40 days, and he's going to get a whole new set of tablets. And in the process, Moses is now pretty insecure, and he asks God, if you have confidence in me, let me see your presence, let me see who you are. And God tells Moses, man may not see my face and live, but I'll cause my presence to pass behind you, but turn your back and cover your eyes. So Moses vicariously experiences God's presence, but never is allowed to see God. Just from the experience in the terms of the experiencing God's presence, his face is transformed, and it becomes red and enlarged, and people fear him because his face reflects God's radiance from having experienced God's presence. And he conveys to the people instructions for building the tabernacle, and that takes chapter after chapter in terms of the book of Exodus to get through the whole process. The tabernacle is erected, the wilderness journey commences, and God meets with Moses in the tabernacle throughout the journey to convey his laws. And only when the Exodus generation died off is the law-giving process ended. Next slide, please. Let's skip this guy. Next slide. So when Moses returns to the camp, the people fear him. We already seen it. Okay, one more slide. Next slide. What sets this covenant apart from others is the first time morality and ethics are represented as the foundation principles for a society. And it's represented as the revelation of the will of God, not of a king or a ruler, but these are God's laws. Next, please. Next. God revealed his will not to a selected prophet or king who transmits it to people, but all the people are said to have witnessed the theophany because they heard God's saying the words, and people gave their assent to the teaching and thus become answerable for fulfilling the terms of the covenant, making God's laws their own. The significance of the Sinai experience is that Israel came to know the existence of the living God, the special demands by God of his people, and it's rooted in Israel, not rooted in Israel's merit, but in God's will, because Israel has not done anything yet to merit that will. A number of problems that surface in the reading of the text, and I try to touch on some of them as we went through that. Yahweh spoke to Moses to warn the people they cannot come up to the mountain. They cannot come up to the mountain to see Yahweh. How are they going to witness the event if that was the purpose? How are they going to know that this is not what Moses created if they're not the witnesses? What happened to the idea that people should witness the giving of the covenant? Several verses indicate the Israelites are really eager to experience this and burst forward, break through the boundaries they established, and witness the theophany. And yet there are other verses that indicate that people dread the experience and tell Moses to talk to God, and we'll listen to you when you come down from the mountain. After God begins to speak to the people, they're stricken with terror. They inform Moses they can't listen any further. So the whole witnessing experience, in terms of which was one of the main concepts in terms of ideas, is really trashed. Next slide, please. Other problems. The narrative emphasizes that the Sinai experience of the dying was only auditory. The mountain was covered by cloud. The purpose of the event was for the people to overhear God speaking with Moses. Yet in Deuteronomy, and I give it the citation, it says only sound was experienced. Yet in the Exodus, it states the Yahweh himself descended in the full sight of the entire people. So which is it? Did the people see God or did they just hear him? After the Decalogue had been heard, Moses remained on the mountain and received the laws. When these were delivered to Moses on the mountain, he's instructed, come up to the Lord. But he's already on the mountain. Where's he going to come up to? Isn't Moses on the mountaintop? The text tells us that Moses came down and told the people. So he was up on the mountain when God called him. So there was nothing to go up to it. So it seems to be an inconsistency. When Moses ascends the mountain to obtain the tablets, he learned that he'd been summoned for a different purpose, for a different reason, not to receive the covenant, not to receive the Ten Commandments, but rather he gets instructions on how to build a tabernacle. It seems to be somewhat deceptive here. Next slide, please. So Moses returns to the camp, he convenes the people, conveys detailed instructions for building the tabernacle and fashioning sacred articles. The remainder of the year spent erecting the tabernacle, and on completion, they leave the mountain and the wilderness journey begins, which takes 40 years according to the text. The process of law giving continues intermittently throughout the wandering in the wilderness, throughout the books of Numbers and Leviticus. Next slide. Numbers 30, at Numbers, it tells us the law giving process is over just as the Israelites arrive at Moab, which is just or to cross over the Jordan River to enter Canaan. 2 months before the end of the 40th year, after the 10 words are communicated to God by God at Sinai, Moses convenes an assembly to deliver all the laws to the people at Moab so they would have an understanding of the covenant. I ask, what's wrong with the picture? He already told them and earlier what was in the covenant. They celebrated it. Why is it new? So the question in terms of this tabernacle that were instructions is also problematic. The description of the architecture and implements described contains repeated references to gold, silver, acacia wood. Where are they going to get these items in the wilderness? The amount of gold is staggering. It's estimated by engineers to be about 2,000 pounds of gold. At the current price of gold, that would be $43 million. The tabernacle is meant to house the manifestation of God. And so believing is telling us, this part of the text is telling us God was on earth with the Israelites during this journey. So the interpretation, when the tabernacle is built, God's presence fills it. Moses could not enter the tent. Could this have even become completed in the wilderness by a group of former slaves? There's another point in the book of Exodus, that precedes this, Exodus 20. It says, God tells Moses to tell the people, make for me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your sacrifices of well-being, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will bless you. If you make me an altar of stones, do not build it with hewn stones, for wielding your tool on them would have profaned them. So we have two different ways of worshiping God in the same biblical text. One, God's going to be in this tabernacle and comes on earth. The second is through the altars. God's up is still somewhere in heaven, wherever heaven is. And altars will be built in multiple places because God doesn't live on earth and doesn't require a residence to be set aside for him to travel with the people. We have two different ideas in terms of how to worship God in coming from the book of Exodus. The philosopher Maimonides had dealt with that issue in terms of why was it necessary to have such a tabernacle? Why the text indicate that such a structure would be essential? And he said the people that ultimately would become Israel spent many years in slavery, where they were exposed to a pagan culture. Next, please. As part of that pagan culture, God realized that a sudden transition from paganism to monotheism would be impossible, so the people are not capable of abandoning everything that they had become accustomed to in Egypt. So if the Egyptians had a sacrificial cult, so would the Israelites. If the Egyptians had a formal priesthood, so would the Israelites. If the Egyptians had a prescribed function like burning incense, so did the Israelites. If the Egyptians had practiced their religious and luxurious surroundings, so should the Israelites. In this way, Maimonides says, the former slaves could be weaned away from the idolatry that they experienced in Egypt. Archaeologists confirm that in the Near East, temples were often built that were very opulent as places to worship their God or the God of that land. And so it follows that theory, but most people recognize that it could not have occurred in the wilderness. The second covenant occurs 40 years later. So the audience, this is in the book of Exodus, the audience is the elders, the former slaves. The setting is in the wilderness. And the rationale is for compliance. As a result of God's intervention in history. But in the book of Deuteronomy, which says this is the first time that revelation occurs, it's with the living standing here. the descendants of the original Apuror Hebrews who made it. And the setting was in Beth Peor, in the land of the Amorites, just before the Israelites would cross over into Canaan. And the rationale, again, is for compliance, and so that it may go well with the people and their children forever. So we have two different revelations that take place within the biblical text, one in Exodus, one in Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is frequently referred to as the repetition of the law, but Deuteronomy does not recognize that there was a first revelation. Okay. Next. Now, in Exodus 24, we have an interesting statement in terms of the conclusion of the revelation process that Moses experienced. And it says the following: Then he being God, said to Moses, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and bow low from afar. But only Moses shall come near the Lord. Moses went to the people and repeated all the commands of the Lord. Then Moses wrote down all the commands of the Lord. Then he took the record of the covenant, read it to all the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Then Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's children, who were named in the text, ascended. They saw the God of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and they drank. Now it follows that 24, 12, 18 is another statement of the conclusion. Okay. Now Yahweh said, come up to me. I will give you the stone tablets with the teachings and commandments. And when Moses ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain. And on the seventh day, he called from inside the cloud, and the Lord appeared on the sight of the Israelites as a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. And Moses went inside the cloud, ascending the mountain, and Moses remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So we have two different conclusions. So if you would, I want to let anybody, I want to open this up for discussion in terms of 4 questions. There's always 4 questions when it comes to Passover. Who wrote the commandments? In the first conclusion and the second conclusion. Do we have it open?
Yes.
For conversation? Anybody want to volunteer?
I'm not seeing any volunteers at the moment. If you want to say something, unmute yourself and you can answer.
It seems that that Moses wrote them, but from God's instruction.
Okay, there are 2 different ones. Remember, these are 2 different conclusions that have been placed the same place. Okay, and I'll tell you there are 2 different authors. Okay, the first conclusion says God wrote them, God gave them to him. The second conclusion, God gave them. The first one, Moses wrote it down from God's instructions. Okay. The second question: what is the role of Aaron and his sons and the elders in the first ascent?
If you, I don't see any hands, but if you
Okay.
would like.
Should we go back over it? Can we go back 2 slides?
Sure.
Let's go back 2 slides. Okay.
Here.
Slide number 1.
Okay.
Then he, that's God, said to Moses, come up with Aaron and Aaron's sons and 70 elders and bow low. But only Moses comes close to me. Moses said to the people and repeated all the commands of the Lord. Then Moses wrote down all the commands. Then he took the record of the covenant and read it to all the people. And then they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Then Moses, Aaron ascended, and they saw the God of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank and had a big celebration. Now let's look at the second one. Second conclusion. Now Yahweh said, come up to me. I will give you the stone tablets and the teaching and commandments. This one, they're done. God's giving it to Moses. And when Moses ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain. And on the seventh day, he called from inside the cloud. The Lord appeared to the sight of Israelites as a consuming fire. Moses went inside the cloud, ascending the mountain, and Moses remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Two different conclusions. Let's go back over the questions.
Gary has his hand up, Sheldon.
Okay.
Gary,
Sheldon, I'm confused about the second, what you refer to as conclusion. The elders and Aaron went up with Moses, but not all the way. They saw fire. Is that seeing God?
They saw what?
They
They
saw,
saw God. They saw God, right? That's what the text says.
it says they saw fire,
Wait a minute.
consuming fire.
Wait,
Okay, the Lord appeared as a consuming fire. Yeah, that's very confusing.
okay. Can we go back to the first one again? Previous, yeah. Last line. Moses and Aaron ascended. They saw the God of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. Right? What's wrong with that statement? How does that statement conflict with an earlier statement that I just talked about earlier?
Harvey Gerstein, do you have?
Well, earlier it says that God told Moses he couldn't look at him. And here,
Yes, absolutely. You cannot look at me and live. Man cannot see God and live. Good. Right on, Harvey. Okay,
And
let's
then
go.
another person that has a Galaxy tablet says God seems to change or add his commands over time. So I'm not sure if you want to,
Beautiful statement. Wonderful statement.
if you want Galaxy tablet, if I'm not sure your name, but if you want to
Yeah.
comment,
Yeah, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, well, it seems like that he how do I word it? He seems to misjudge how the people react. He doesn't know people very well. And so their reaction, maybe he wasn't ready for. He's kind of learning. He tells Moses what to do, and then when he finds out the reaction, he has to change things around. That's what it
Okay.
sounds like.
Okay. But you see the difference between the two statements. Okay, let's go back to the questions. 2 slides back. 2 slides. Yeah. Okay.
This here.
So who wrote the commandments? In the first one, it's Moses. The second one, God's giving it to him. What is the role of Aaron and elder sons in the first ascent? They're witnesses, right? There are no witnesses in the second ascent. Next question. What is it that people observe at the conclusion of the second ascent? Only clouds and fire. They see nothing. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. The first one, Aaron and sons see God. In the second one, people see nothing. How does seeing the God, well, we've talked about how does seeing the God of Israel described in the first ascent vary from other statements? We're told very early that not even Moses can see God and live. So we have inconsistencies.
Mhm.
Let's skip 2 slides, and I want to get to the main. Okay. Okay. Bonus question: how do you explain the different endings? Anybody want to talk about that?
Yeah, go ahead,
How do you
Marilena.
explain the different endings?
We had different writers.
Ah, wonderful. Say that again.
we had different writers of these books.
Very good. That's the point.
Yeah.
The reason the text is so difficult to handle, so difficult to read, is there are different writers. And what has happened is many centuries after each writer wrote, the text was combined and these different writings were consolidated, redacted, edited to try to make them fit, and they don't fit very well. And it's very complicated. That's the difficulty in the text. That's why there's so many inconsistencies that I try to bring up, and that was difficult to understand. And so what we are going to do in the class next week is I'm going to share with you what each of the 4 writers wrote on their own. Okay? What scholars have been able to do, and namely, I'm going to use scholarship that came out of Hebrew University in Jerusalem in terms of what the 4 writers, J, E, P, and D, who, if you've taken any of my courses, you know I talk about what's called the documentary hypothesis. We'll go into that, and we know now what each of the 4 writers said about this experience, and we're going to take them individually. We're going to look at them from the standpoint of what does each of the writers say it happened that is in common with the others, and in what ways are they inconsistent, and why might they be inconsistent? So we're going to find consistencies in the 4 writers and inconsistencies in the 4 writers. And we'll look at that next week and come up with a better understanding in terms of what the experience was that was being reported on at Sinai. Before we do that, I want to just complete in terms of talk about one other concept that I think is important to understand. Throughout the text, we say God spoke to Moses, or God said this, or what do we mean when we say God spoke? Because the surest way to misunderstanding the meaning of revelation, and that is what we're talking about when we talk about Sinai, is revelation, is to take it literally that God spoke. What language did he speak in? Word stands for different meanings in different situations. When we say God spoke, it is a metaphor that is to be perceived and understood by humanity. It is conveyed by an expression of voice, or as an action of divinity, as a phenomenon, as something other than voice, and much more profound. It is a way of understanding God's intent. What is meant that Moses heard or experienced, what the people heard or at Sinai, does not refer to a perception of the eye or ear, but we're talking about a spiritual perception, and that is what is meant by revelation. Is it conceivable that the words spoken, in quotation marks, by God at Sinai were audible to Moses alone and not the people? And that's what I'd like for you to think about before next week. The biblical authors were limited in terms of how they could express this phenomena that had no other precedent. And so they used language that they were comfortable with. So we end up with a text that has different endings, and his different endings make it very difficult for us to understand the revelation itself. And there are inconsistencies throughout the narratives, and there are contradictions that are attributable to different sources of the text. There's differences in the name of the mountain on which the covenant was delivered. There are differences in whether the revelation took place on a mountaintop or whether it took place inside a cloud, or how the theophany was experienced. Are there differences in terms of how to worship God? The differences in terms of what was heard, what was not heard. And what we're looking at in terms of next week is how each of these four authors understood the theophany and what they shared in common in terms of a common understanding of what it is that Israel is to be held accountable for, what the laws and what the nature of revelation was. So that's the end of today. Any other questions that you'd like to ask at this point? Yes.
Oh, you muted yourself, Marilita.
Where did the plague story come from?
The plague story, you're talking about in terms of the Exodus, right? Most of the stories in Egypt were from the E source. Are you familiar with the sources? Most of them come from the E source. Okay.
Well, then who wrote the commandments?
Who wrote the? God did, didn't he?
It
We'll
could have
we'll
been
see.
Moses.
We'll see. We'll get to that
Whoever's-
next week.
Whoever's interpreting
Whoever's interpreting. Yes. Very good.
Okay.
and their biases.
And we'll remember, we're not only going to be talking about the commandments, which are the basics, but then in terms of what are the laws to create a just society. And we'll get to that
Yes.
next week, right?
You
We'll get
mean
to
you're
that
gonna
next
go
week.
into you're gonna talk about the Supreme Court?
Well, that's a little bit later on. I think Harvey did that.
Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And don't miss the other extension next week. It's next Wednesday afternoon. So we'll continue this conversation in Sheldon's teaching on what happened at Mount Sinai. Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for another wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you for coming.